the members of the Massachusetts Teachers Association, working together for students, public education, and our communities.
It is my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker. I first heard about Jesse Hagopian when he led the Garfield High School boycott of the MAP tests back in 2013. I'll never forget waking to the news that morning and, in my excitement and delight, sending flowers to the faculty of Garfield High School in Seattle. Those educators taught us all a lesson in courage and solidarity. Jesse Hagopian is a history teacher and co-advisor to the Black Student Union at Garfield High School in Seattle. He is widely recognized for championing that successful boycott of the measures of academic progress. Jesse is the editor of the book, More Than a Score, The New Uprising Against High-Stakes Testing. This book is a collection of essays, poems, speeches, and interviews with people who are defying the corporate education reform model, often at great personal and professional risk, and fueling the movement to reclaim and transform public education. Jesse dedicates the book to the Garfield High School Bulldogs, who he says boycotted the MAP test, changed my life, and ignited a movement. And to those testifiers of tomorrow who don't yet know the might of their courage, but will one day soon rise up to make education more than a score. He argues that under the current testocracy, the, quote, elite stratum of society that finances and promotes competition and privatization in public education rather than collaboration, critical thinking, and the public good, is killing creativity and teaching our kids that making a mistake is a horrible transgression. Jesse is also an associate editor of the magazine Rethinking Schools and a contributor to the Seattle Times op-ed page, among many other accomplishments. We are really lucky to have him with us here today. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Jesse Hagopian. Jesse, you come up.
Oh, thank you guys so much. It is a real honor to be here with my brothers and sisters across the country. We just had our own union convention in Washington State, but to be here with Barbara is very special. She didn't mention that she is a contributor to the book, so you should look at her chapter as well that helped to lay the groundwork for our boycott. And I'm here today to tell you that we are currently in the largest uprising against high-stakes standardized testing in the history of the United States. Never before have more parents, students, and teachers engaged in acts of defiance against the reduction of a child's intellect to a single score, right? And you can see it in the polls, right? Over 50% say that standardized testing is not useful at all last year, right? Before the huge eruptions that we've seen across the country. And I think it is an incredible just beginning to this. And Barbara talked about the role that the Garfield High School MAP test boycott played in helping to really kick off this resistance. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment, but I wanted to say that I began to see this issue in a whole new light this year because I'd been fighting against these tests as a teacher for some time, but this year, my 5-year-old entered kindergarten, and I began to see what these tests mean through the eyes of a parent. And so I want to congratulate you all for the stand that you took in your vote yesterday to support parents who are declaring their intentions to opt out. But I want to tell you, the first day of school, there was a huge ceremony at my son's school this year because they were renaming his school due to the fact that it was becoming a bilingual program. They were going to have Spanish and Mandarin immersion. And it was really exciting. They had this ribbon-cutting ceremony. They brought all the kids out on the front lawn to enjoy wonderful cultural performances from the different countries that spoke the languages that were represented. And they had all these different politicians and school district officials come. The principal gave a wonderful speech. And then the governor's education aide took the podium. And she leaned into the microphone, and there's all the students arrayed out in front of her. And she says, "I want to congratulate you all for making the choice to come to this wonderful school this year, because you will now be prepared to compete in the global economy." Cheers did not erupt from the third grade section. I wasn't like, yes, my son now will be able to keep down some other father's son in Mexico as he learns Spanish. Right? I mean, I thought I was sending him to this school so that he could learn to communicate with more people and collaborate with more people on the planet, right? To work together to solve problems. No longer is education about how do we teach our young people to interact better with each other, right? Or, I wanted my son to be able to learn how to help someone who had a bad day, right? His goals for the year were to tie a shoe and to be a better basketball player and to learn how to speak Spanish. But their goals are entirely different. I want to read to you a passage that appears on the sidebar of the Common Core website that I found in my research for my book, and it proudly displays this quote from Edward B. Russ Jr., Chairman and CEO of State Farm Insurance Companies, who tells us why we need these new standards and why we need these new standardized tests that come shrink-wrapped with the standards. He says, quote, "State-by-state adoption of these standards is an important step towards maintaining our country's competitive edge. With a skilled and prepared workforce, the business community will be better prepared to face the challenges of the international marketplace." That is their vision of the purpose of public education. And I'm here today to tell you we are going to turn that upside down and inside out. We are going to remake the entire purpose of what schools are about. And it's happening all across the country because they are using these scores to test and to punish, not to help, not to enlighten, right? Not to empower. But we see that they reduce the intellectual process, the emotional process of teaching and learning to a score that they then use to deny kids graduation. They then use that score to tie your evaluation to it and bust up unions and the union protections. They use that score to close schools, as they did in Chicago with the stroke of a pen, closing 50 and dozens in Philadelphia, and we've seen it all across the country. Right now in Baltimore, right, they're getting ready to close schools, and you wonder why people took to the streets and rioted when their communities are being savaged like this by business interests. And that's why this movement against high-stakes testing is so critical. I don't know if people saw when Louis C.K. went on Letterman. He got on Letterman and he said, Letterman sits him down and says, "Well, welcome to the show. How are you doing?" And he says, "Well, I'm pretty good. It's kind of stressful in my home, though, because my daughters are taking these new Common Core tests." And Letterman says, "Well, what happens if they don't pass?" And he says, "I don't know how these things work exactly, but I believe they just burn the school down." Not exactly right, but I told that joke to Helen Gim, who is a contributor to the book and a parent activist in Philadelphia, and she didn't laugh like you all did, because it actually is a scorched earth policy that they are bringing in cities across America. And to see people standing up in great acts of courage all over the country to fight back has just been incredible. It started for me at Garfield High School when a renowned reading teacher, Mallory Clark, gave me a call and said she needed to talk to me after school. And I was building rep, so I'm used to meeting with members about different issues. But I could tell this one was something different when she sat me down, just the look in her eye. And she said, "Jesse, I'm not giving the MAP test this year." And I just wanted to get up and pump my fist because I've been working against this test for some time. And I helped to get a resolution passed in our union saying we didn't think this was an appropriate measure of student learning and shouldn't be tied to teacher evaluations. But that was a symbolic act, and here was a teacher ready to take action and refuse. And from there, we met with all the departments in our building. We found out that none of them found this test useful. None of them found that this test was helping to drive instruction or helping their pedagogy in any way. And so we called a meeting in the library, an all-staff meeting. Garfield High School is the biggest school in Seattle, most diverse school. Some 90 faculty there voted unanimously to refuse to administer the MAP test. And we called a press conference in the second floor language arts classroom. Our first fear was that no one would show up and the district would quietly punish us without any recognition of what was happening. And our next fear was when all the media showed up, oh no, are we really going through with this? But we did, and it was a while before we heard back from the school district. They didn't know how to respond. It was like a week before they responded, and an email came up in my inbox, and I scanned it, and it was from the superintendent, and it was very cordial. But at the end, it said, just in case there was some misunderstanding, the MAP test is mandatory, right? And it was nice, but the thing that it was also was official notice, right? And now at this point, if you don't administer the MAP, it's insubordination. But a fortuitous thing happened. The bell rang for lunch, and our testing coordinator got on the intercom, and she said, all staff are to report to the teacher lounge because a school in Florida has sent us pizza in solidarity with the MAP test boycott. And it brought us all together, and over pizza, people realized this fight wasn't just about Garfield High School. This fight wasn't just about the MAP test or our students. This was about a test and punish regime that was going wild all across the country, and that people were counting on us. And it wasn't just about, are we going to back down now in our own situation, but people needed a victory in this fight, and we couldn't. And so when the superintendent came out with a threat several days later of a 10-day suspension without pay for these teachers, the most beautiful thing I've ever seen happened. It was the entire faculty losing its fear. And I can tell you, it was a real pleasure and an honor to get up early in the morning and go to work every day. It was this electric atmosphere at Garfield about when is the next action, when's the next rally, who is the next country that's going to send us letters of support or flowers of support in Barbara's case. We were getting messages from all over, and it was truly becoming a social movement to reclaim public education. And the most wonderful thing about it is that it didn't stop at Garfield, that it spread to 7 other schools in Seattle, and then students in Portland walked out, and students in Chicago walked out of the test, and students, parents, and teachers all over the country began walking out. And I just want to read a couple of quick passages from the book that I think capture what pundits called the education spring that erupted that spring of 2013. This is from the Providence Student Union in Rhode Island, and they wrote about their creative actions to resist the tests. They said, passerbys in downtown Providence jumped, startled, as a ghoulish-looking crowd of young people turned the corner of Kennedy Plaza. Green skin shined, sunken eyes stared, and torn, blood-splattered clothes dragged as they shuffled down Westminster Street. These dreadful-looking young men and women gathered at the entrance of the Rhode Island Department of Education, where instead of battering down the door in search of brains, these zombies showed they already had plenty. One demonstrator stepped forward, megaphone in hand. We are here to protest the use of high-stakes standardized testing and the zombifying effect it is having on our state's young people. And they went on to organize a let's make the adults take the test. And they said, okay, these tests are the guardian of whose career in college ready? Well, let's go get the professionals, the lawyers, the doctors, the politicians, and sit them down and have them take it. So they administered it, and 2 weeks later, they called a press conference to release the results. 60% failed the test. Yes, I love it. You all clap for failure. That's wonderful. But no longer could they say that these were really the measure of who's going to be successful in life. It was ludicrous to claim that anymore, and their movement, in fact, I think it was primarily the student union and their relentless work over the last 3 years that resulted in the state legislature passing a 3-year moratorium on the high stakes of the standardized tests there. There's a couple more stories I would love to share with you guys because they're so creative and I think inspiring. Let me just share this one from St. Paul. I was checking my Facebook feed one day soon after the MAP boycott, and I saw a little story pop up in a paper about a union president who was negotiating a contract to get standardized testing out of the teacher contract. And I didn't think much of it until I saw that, well, state law mandates that there was standardized testing in the teacher evaluation. And so they pointed out that she was trying to bargain a contract that was illegal. And I said, well, there's someone I need to call up. And so I called her up and I interviewed her for the book. And it was Mary Catherine Ricker, who is now the executive vice president of the AFT. And I asked her, so what do you say to people who say to you what you are advocating for in refusing the MCA tests in your evaluation isn't legal? So how can you do that? And she says, it's the school district that's saying that, but they're not dreaming. All throughout history, we have seen really bad laws changed by people who have decided to take action that was illegal because they couldn't act on a law as it was. So I say, who are you inspired by history? And she said, my most immediate inspiration is Local 28, my union. In 1946, there was a women's union and a men's union. The women's union was Local 28 and the men's was Local 43. The women's union went on strike, and the men's union joined them in November of 46. And it was illegal to strike back then. They did on November 26, which is not the warmest time of year to be walking a picket line in Minnesota. And they called it the Strike for Better Schools. And do you know what they were fighting for? They were fighting for modern textbooks. They were fighting for the kids to have classes not in the boiler room. They were fighting for a way for districts to provide shoes for kids who came to school shoeless. I look back at the things they were fighting for, and they were fighting for the same things we're fighting for now, the schools our children deserve. And she goes on to point out that she's glad Frederick Douglass didn't just look at what was legal, right, and fought for what was right and what was just. And that we are on the same side of that struggle, and that we desperately need to redefine education and to stand and fight back. Because we face immense challenges in our world today that education has to be organized around solving. We face endless wars, right? Our country has found trillions of dollars. In my entire teaching career, our nation has been bombing the Middle East, using trillions of dollars to destroy lives and kill children, rather than using that money to build up our own school system and support our children right here at home. We face the greatest income inequality in U.S. history. You know that there are 85 people that have as much wealth as the bottom 3.5 billion people on the planet? That is a sickness. That is really just disgusting. And we know what that looks like every day at school, because we know that this year studies show that half of children in the U.S. public school system now are in poverty, right, in the world's richest country. We have mass incarceration in this country on unprecedented levels. The United States today is the biggest jailer in world history. We have more people in prison than China, right? Than all of Europe combined. We have more black people behind bars than were slaves on plantations in 1850. That is a social catastrophe that education has to have something to say about. Let's look at what we have. Violence against women and sexual assault that goes unchecked. You see it rampant on college campuses. It's a really disturbing rape culture that exists and is unfortunately promoted in the media. And 1 in 4 women today report having been sexually assaulted. We have perhaps, a broken immigration system. We see it every day in our school when our families are split apart and parents are deported, right? And perhaps the biggest challenge of all is climate change, because if we don't fix that one, we won't have time to get to fix all the rest of the problems. Right? Scientists tell us that if the global climate raises by 3 degrees, that it will be runaway climate change that's irreversible, and the planet will no longer sustain human life. And that is not a long-term prospect. That is a very real and immediate future that faces us. And none of those problems that I just spoke about can be solved by bubbling in A, B, C, or D. We need to teach our kids critical thinking. We need to teach our kids civic courage and leadership. We need to teach our kids imagination, right? These are the skills that we desperately need if we're going to solve those problems, if we are going to be able to rise up and fix these social and fix these economic and fix these ecological disasters that we face in our world today. And so I just want to end with a couple last reflections about the importance of our work. Because there are those that say we have to have these tests because they show us that there's an achievement gap, and that then we have to then go and address that gap. And these tests are the key to closing the achievement gap in this country. But I'll tell you this, if you know where standardized tests came from and when and how they entered the U.S. public school system, you will never buy that line again. Because Standardized testing entered the U.S. public school system in the early 1900s as a product of the eugenics movement. Back then, white supremacists were very proud of their ideology of eugenics. It wasn't something to hide. It was something to show openly, and these tests demonstrated it. And so what better way to show the hierarchy of intelligences? A man named Carl Brigham was at Princeton University when World War I broke out. And he joined the military to use his retooled IQ test to separate the grunt soldiers from the officers. And after World War I, he returned to Princeton and he wrote a book called A Study in American Intelligence, where he lamented that because of the Negro in America, American intelligence is rapidly declining and will be outpaced by Europe. And he went on to adapt his IQ test to become the SAT. Did you know that was the origin of the SAT exam? And today, we give the same ABCD bubble tests that rank and sort children not based on their intelligence, but based on their access to resources, right? We know that researchers have long told us that what these tests measure above all is your zip code, not your aptitude. It measures your proximity to wealth and the dominant culture. Not any intrinsic value that you have, right? And so that shouldn't surprise you that W.E.B. Du Bois, the founder of the NAACP and one of the most important black intellectuals in American history, was also one of the first outspoken critics against these abusive exams, right? And I say that our movement today stands on the shoulder of giants, these important black intellectuals who led the charge, and that we are rallying to today in this fight to transform education. So I want to give the last word to a special student that wrote for the book, and then take some questions. This student's name is Amber Kudla, and she was the valedictorian of her class at a school in New York. And her principal said to her, "You have to give the graduation speech, Amber. You were the valedictorian, and we have a special place for you to share your thoughts with the class." And she said, "Absolutely not. I am not a public speaker. I don't have anything to tell the class. I'm not going to do it." And the principal said, "Well, it's not that you have to do it. It's just that you would bring shame to your community, your family, and your school." Okay, so she relented. I'm glad she did. I don't know if the principal is or not. So the first thing she did was title her speech. And the title was printed in the programs that were given to the hundreds of people at the graduation ceremony. And she titled her speech, 518-455-4767, which was the phone number of the state legislator who was pushing the high-stakes exams. And they hadn't killed her creativity yet, had they? So I just want to read to you a short excerpt from this incredible speech that she delivered to her graduating class. She says, "As for the argument that assessments are challenging our students more, sure, that's true. It's a challenge to fit the same amount of material into 1 year with more exams. It's a challenge to memorize loads of facts in time for the next test. It's also a challenge to eat a teaspoon of cinnamon in one bite without choking. But what are you really accomplishing?" At this point, I'd like to throw a slightly relevant quote by a famous person into the mix to make my speech seem more legitimate. That appears to be how these things work. So Albert Einstein once said, "Everybody's a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing it's stupid." We can't judge somebody's intelligence by how well he does in a small group of isolated classes. Everyone learns differently, so education is not something that can be successfully standardized. Anyway, this is why I tried so hard to get out of this speech. Not because I don't respect all of you, I do. It's just that valedictorian is a label, and I don't respect what it stands for. I am not the smartest person in our class. I could learn something new from every single one of you. I'm good at memorizing things, but that's not so useful outside of the standardized world of high school, and I'm pretty sure a lot of you have been more successful than I was, unless your standard for judging success is a Scantron sheet. Yeah. To me, those words held special meaning. As somebody who was humiliated by these tests my entire life, I knew from the moment I was in third grade and I sat down with my teacher and my mom, and the teacher showed my mom how far below the curve I was, and that little dot down there meant that everyone else was higher than me. I knew from that moment in third grade till about halfway through college that I was not intelligent, and I had the proof, right, in the scores. And to hear from somebody who had been praised by this system, right, who had the high test scores but knew how fraudulent it was as a measure, was really, I think, special to me. And I think it's indicative of a growing consciousness that's sweeping young people across the country. You saw the largest walkout in U.S. history against high-stakes exams in Colorado, where they refused to take the exit exams earlier this year. You saw almost 1,000 students in New Mexico in almost completely segregated Latino schools walk out of the PARCC exams and refuse to take the new Common Core tests. In my own city, at Garfield High School this year, they asked us to take the new Common Core tests. Let's see how that worked out for them. Well, the 9th graders that refused to take the MAP test were now the very 11th graders they were asking to take the Common Core test. 95% of students opted out of the exam at Garfield High School. But I don't want to brag too much, because down the road there was a school named Nathan Hale that got 100%, and another school, Nova, that got 100% of both 10th and 11th grader Common Core tests. The movement is exploding, and nowhere bigger than New York State, where 200,000 parents said, "No, my kid is not a test score. My kid is a thoughtful, caring young person that I want to grow up to be more than a score." And I'm in this fight with you guys. Anything I can do to help, I'll be right there with you. Thank you.
The members of the Massachusetts Teachers Association, working together for students, public education, and our communities.